Well, the big issue that played out at last week's spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank is dealing with the rising debt stock globally as countries deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in Nigeria, debt sustainability has remained a major concern based on the debt statistics published by the National Bureau of Statistics and Debt Management Office. Nigeria's gross debt rose by 20.1% to 32.9 trillion naira, while the federal government's borrowing advanced 23.4% year-on-year to 26.9 trillion naira in fourth quarter. For many, if care is not taken, Nigeria may be running into debt crisis. Well, Tunde Lemo, a former deputy governor of the central bank, will have this conversation with us. Good morning. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemo, for joining us on the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes. So, many believe that Nigeria's debt has more than doubled, since 2014. How can we justify this level of debt and, of course, the dismal use of proceeds?
Well, you will recall that around 2016, we had what I would call revenue shock resulting from the drop in oil prices. Prior to then, we had the price rising to as high as $140 a barrel, and that plummeted very significantly. So there was a rational need for us to ratchet up our borrowing. And of course, last year was also a bad year globally because of the pandemic. So all over the globe, everybody, or most countries, were actually on borrowing spree. However, I believe the time has come for us to begin to look at the debt burden because it's becoming pretty worrisome. Some people are still in that El Dorado of a sense, saying that the debt to GDP is still around 22%, which, if compared to our peers globally, is low. But I say that we should not reference GDP because of the fact that the tax revenue is very weak in Nigeria. And so we should be referencing debt stock to revenue. And it's getting to a point now that we should begin to apply some brakes.
Well, despite the rising debt, Nigeria still plans to go to the Eurobond market soon. What's your take on this?
Well, I had the minister say so. I don't have the details with me. I believe it will be project tied. I believe, yes, we need to apply brake in acquiring new debt, but there could be exceptions, particularly if projects can pay for such borrowing. However, we need to be very careful. Zambia is already defaulting on the Eurobond. And so default, there's an inflection point. There's a point that it begins to affect your revenue. Last year, the bulk of federal government revenue that went to debt service was as high as 83%. And even this year, it could be as high as 60%. And so we must begin to see how we wind down and then ensure that we do not increase this stock. It's going rapidly up. It's going to approach around 38 trillion. Is it 38 or 28? 32 trillion.
32.9, yeah.
32.9 trillion by the end of the year. And this is pretty much high, especially the foreign component. The foreign component is already around $28 billion, almost near the pre-2005 position before we got the debt relief. And so it's like Nigeria is on the march again. We need to apply the brake, otherwise we may have issues with debt sustainability.
Well, a lot of people will say it's not a bad thing to actually borrow, but it is what you use the money that you borrowed for.
I agree with you, but if you look at what we've been doing with the money we've borrowed, it's not as if we've been using every cent or every naira we borrowed on projects that pay for themselves. Because of the nature of our governance structure, a lot of it goes into salaries and wages. A lot of it goes into so many other things. If they were to be dedicated to infrastructure build-up and so on and so forth, we know foreign debt is good for capital accumulation. It's also good to power your economy. But when you begin to spend it on consumption and you do not have a rethink on how to reduce the size of governance, the cost of governance, and so on and so forth, I think is becoming an issue that must be taken by government head on.
Now, taking back to the Eurobond issues, well, of course, we've seen what is happening in the U.S. It's expected that U.S. inflation would exceed the upper limit of about 2%, which means that dollar interest rates will increase. So what do you think will be the impact of perhaps higher dollar interest rates on Nigeria's debt sustainability? Meanwhile, we are seeing our naira being devalued.
Well, the issue really is, it depends on the nature of the borrowing. Some of the borrowing, if the rates are not flexible, so the rates have been fixed, and if we're lucky to have gotten the borrowing when the dollar rate was low, I'm not sure so much of it will be replied. But now that we are going to the market, we will then be borrowing at a new rate. But my worry actually is also the domestic borrowing. Yes, I know that as naira depreciates, of course, the debt burden becomes more. 2-3 years ago, we knew the exchange rate. Now, even the stock is pretty much high. Even if interest rate remains frozen, the quantum in naira is becoming more worrisome. But today, when you look at the way federal government coped last year, it was because naira borrowing rate was pretty much low. Central bank was embarking on what they call heterodox approach. But today, they are beginning to adopt the monetary policy orthodoxy by having to allow the bond price to be determined by the market. So before Q2, Q3, we may have interest rates on treasury bill rising to 10 to 12%. And the implication for this is very, very enormous, even for servicing of local debt, not to talk of the foreign debt. So both ways, it becomes double whammy. And this is really why we must begin to address debt stock.
But do you think these lending institutions have any responsibility here, knowing fully well that we might not be able to repay some of these loans? What do you think, should be done at this point, from the lending institutions' point of view?
You see, the lenders are wiser than you think. When you borrow so much, the country risk spikes. And even so, the rate at which you borrow new money is higher because, of course, everybody prices the risk. So it also affects your exchange rate because, of course, it affects capital flow. Everybody coming to Nigeria will say, look, given the debt profile, it is very unlikely that I'll be able to repatriate my capital when the amount is due. So it's much more than just the decision of the lenders. The lenders are pretty much smart, but again, the country risk, and then of course the terms of trade becomes more stiff. Nobody then wants to give you goods based on maybe what I call you don't have what the bankers call usance credits that you can import and pay later, and then everything will have to be front-loaded. And because of that, of course, it's going to affect importation and terms of trade. And this is really, really, really very complex. I believe Nigeria should understand that it's not anything anybody wants to be in. You can ask Venezuela, ask Greece, and other countries that have been in debt trap. And really, we must begin to look at that.
Now, how do we begin to actually deal with this situation? First of all, the question a lot of people would ask is, where does accountability, come to play in all of this? I mean, signing up a contract and you see perhaps the money jacked up and all of that. Who accounts for what? How do we streamline some of these things that make us borrow so much?
The National Assembly has the responsibility to approve borrowing plan. And so we must begin to interrogate the skills that we have within the National Assembly to actually analyze the Nigerian's balance sheet, to look at what is possible and what is not possible. Because before you borrow, you must have the borrowing plan approved by the National Assembly. So what skills do they have? They must have experts that will analyze these numbers, interrogate, and advise them. Oh, this is coming to a level where there's no longer fiscal space, and then we must begin to think of alternative ways of funding. And it's not as if there are no alternatives, but we don't look into all those areas.
Now, let me come in there. What are the alternatives now? Can we look at that?
Thank you very much. We believe that all the expenditure plan of government, we take them as fixed, when we should begin to look at which one we can postpone and so on and so forth. A good example is the refinery that we are going to be refurbishing. This refinery
and the money will be borrowed
very
as well.
old, the bulk of it, not all. This refinery is very old technology. This was the refinery that was offered for sale by Obasanjo just before Obasanjo government left, which could have been sold. And my take is that if this refinery was even given out free, Nigeria would be saved the humongous cost of the refurbishment. Because do the turnaround. We've been doing turnaround. But let's ask the question, how many barrels or how many liters of fuel have these refineries produced in the last 5 to 10 years? Don't forget, by second half of next year, Dangote refinery will come on stream. The capacity is more than the capacity of all the 4 refineries in Nigeria put together. So it will then happen that we will spend that much, and then by end of next year, the refineries will no longer be working because you have a more modern refinery that will produce at much better rate. And so the money will have gone down the drain. And you can go on and on and on and on. Why are we taking government expenditure as fee? Why can't we shrink governance? I was doing a study. The state of Maharashtra in India has a population of over 100 million. And with the economic size of maybe about that in Nigeria. And yet, the public officers in Maharashtra, the cabinet size is not more than 45. And what is the cabinet size of the entire Nigeria state? All the 37 states and the federal government, and we treat all these costs as if nothing can happen, nothing can be done about them. This is the time for us to begin to look at what we need to do to rein in all this expenditure and free up money and use it for social services, and not to say that this money is not available, the next thing is to go borrowing. I think it's really, really, really very sad. Because in 2005, when we were back on debt relief, and we got significant debt relief from the Paris Club debt of about almost $31 billion, the bulk of our debt then was foreign. Today, only 1/3 is foreign. 2/3, the local debt itself is very, very huge. So when you combine the two, you're having a debt stock of about $90 billion US, local and foreign. And this is very worrisome. What other things do we need to do? Let's strip assets. There are non-core assets that we are still keeping. Let's sell them. Well, it was stated in the budget. I don't know how far they've gone. So we free up some money and use it for social services. Then let's expand tax base. Today, our tax to GDP ratio is about 7%. We committed to IMF that in the medium term to long term, we'll increase it to 15%. Let's do that pretty fast. Let's ensure that even if we want to spend more money, we raise more taxes. We don't have to raise, apart from the VAT that needs to go up slightly, we don't even have to raise individual tax rates. It's all to bring more people into the tax bracket. I keep saying this. The middle, upper middle, and the upper class, we don't pay enough tax in Nigeria. And when you ask questions, they say, well, because we don't see government doing what they are supposed to do. It's chicken and egg. But I think every Nigerian should realize that for government to spend more money, let's sacrifice a little bit, get more tax instead of going borrowing.
Yes, so the federal government is reported to be running an overdraft in excess of 10 trillion at the CBN. Now, the debt is not captured in the natural debt numbers published by the DMO. Now, this is a huge number to be swept, under the carpet. The FG even alluded to this when it said it hopes to securitize the overdraft at the CBN. Now, as a former deputy governor, how can an unhealthy, situation like this be allowed in the first place to arise, and how can we ensure it never happens again?
Well, thank you. I left Central Bank 7 years ago, but let me also say that it is in the law of Central Bank as lender to government to lend money to government. But of course, the act establishing Central Bank prescribes the limit. And so it's a surprise that it's around 10 trillion. But however, we understand the peculiarity of last year and all the issues around COVID. The fact that we didn't have enough fiscal space, And during a challenging period, central banks the world over actually expand their balance sheet and quote and unquote print money. You can call it QE, quantitative easing, or any other means by which, of course, the economy is lubricated. But I think that number is high. And the central bank and the federal government should securitize it. And the meaning of that is, of course, so that they can get the money from the private sector in. Otherwise, it fuels inflation. Inflation number is well over 17% now. And of course, when we call it high-powered money. When you inject too much of high-powered money, it fuels inflation, and inflation hurts the poor even more than the rich.
So how do we checkmate this printing of money? Is there a point at which there's a checkmate procedure to this printing?
The Act, of course, provides the check. It's just for us to ensure that we operate within the Act. If there is a rule, if there is a need for central bank to do more, then the legislators could review the Act and see what they need to do by increasing the headroom. But I would not recommend that. I will sincerely say that government should look into borrowing in the market, local and foreign, if they have to. But again, we have canvassed this argument that there should be alternative source of funding.
Okay, now the Nigerian fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP is approximately 5%. The convergence criteria for regional integration and best practice is usually 3%. Now, Nigeria has hardly gone higher than 3% historically. So what do we have to do, especially now that we seem to be foot dragging or deregulation? I saw yesterday one of the papers, the federal government are planning to defer the removal of subsidy by six months.
It's very, very, very tricky. I'll tell you this. Coming back to convergence criteria, we've been busting the ceiling, but I can say that it's like saying all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So many countries have actually been busting the ceiling because of the peculiarity of the now. However, like we said earlier, we should then begin to see how to reduce the debt stock, which is the argument we've been having since morning. We need to reduce this debt stock. Government should actually take off the subsidy. The subsidy regime is killing the economy. The labor must understand what government has to do. The subsidy on electricity, the subsidy on petroleum must go. However, it is not to say that government will close its eyes to the vulnerable. You know, if you read the IMF Article 4, actually IMF did counsel that even as they do this, there could be program that targets the very, very poor and the vulnerable so that they ameliorate the immediate effect of that. But honestly, these subsidies are drain pipes and they need to go so that government can have some form of fiscal revenue consolidation.
Okay, so the DMO has just released the bond auction calendar. What's your take on that?
Well, I haven't seen it, but the calendar, if you study it properly, for the market to clear, given the appetite of which is what I referred to earlier, the government may have to settle for rates that are slightly above what they are now, which is why my forecast is that rates may have to go up by a few basis points, maybe 200 to 300 basis points going forward.
And do you see that encouraging more savings in the system?
Of course, it will help to mobilize savings. It's been very, very terrible in the past 15 to 18 months that we have very huge negative real interest rates. Yeah. Because savers are being shortchanged. You have interest rates as low as 2-3% when inflation is 15-16%, which means that month after month you are impoverished, and the punishment is only because you are saving. And I think we need to address that pretty high. But the flip side, of course, is that it's going to hurt government purse because government will then need to provide additional funding to service those debts.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemo, for sharing your time with us this Monday morning. We do appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Tunde Lemo is the former Deputy Central Bank Governor.